Welcome everyone to the next installment of our Pen to Palm Leaf series. This is a series that we're having this year of 4 events focused on Buddhist fiction and creative writing. This is event number 3 that begins our spring semester, and another event to come later. Jane Hirschfeld. Jane, do you know the dates?
Late in April.
Late in April.
I forget the dates.
And we will kind of inform you if those of you not signed up for our mailing list.
Website.
We can look on our website. Anyway, today I'm very excited to present Kate Lila Wheeler, who is a wonderful writer and practitioner and teacher, and somehow the 3 all come together effortlessly. As one reads her writing, there's a kind of playfulness and Buddhist insight without being heavy-handed in any way, that one is inspired and provoked and cajoled, which is perfect for her middle name, Lila, which I was just asking her about. Lila is the kind of divine play, and part of the way that the divine plays is by messing up your expectations. You think you know what you're going to get, and you're going to get something different, because that will guide you along. So somehow I think it's perfectly appropriate that that's her middle name chosen. And we're just very excited to have you here at Smith, have you teaching our students and kind of talking to the community and teaching and inspiring us all. So,
There will be a reading.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I should mention the reading.
Thursday.
Thursday, I don't have the specifics about the reading, Jay, do you?
5 o'clock.
It's also at
5
5.
o'clock Thursday.
Here.
5 o'clock Thursday, right here.
Mm-hmm.
There will be a reading. Sorry, I am not prepared for that. But anyway, with that, let us welcome Kate Lila Wheeler.
Thanks, Andy and Jay and Phoebe and old and new friends who are here. Okay, louder, I see. So what if we just start by a little moment of meditation together? And I notice everyone's changing their position all of a sudden. But yeah, let's take a couple of longer, slower breaths. Maybe feel the exhalation. If it's available, to sense yourself embodied here and now. And relax with whatever you've brought with you internally and into this part of the day. Which in my case is relaxed with feeling a little activated to get ready to do the talk. And then just before I really start in, just whatever mental gesture helps you acknowledge and include everyone who's here, so that we're all including each other. Okay. Now, how did my talk go down to page 10 all of a sudden? So Lila on April Fool's Day, I don't know if anyone's been fooled yet by anyone, but I am not going to talk about what I said in the abstract, which maybe I'll give it as my reading, I'm not sure, but I will refer a little bit to some of the history of Buddhist narration as through the canonical literature, because I think it's interesting. But I wanted to talk more about Buddhism and fiction and Buddhist fiction as ways of addressing, how we live, who we are, how to explore and articulate our lives, which are of real importance to each of us, and how stories might influence that for better or worse. So to start, I was thinking about all this stuff today, and the way I write a talk is I usually let things fester, and then I write it down on the day, and it's a little bit messy, so there's something in that. And when I was doing that, I got a little bit nervous, and I started getting cold because I was anxious, and I thought, I'm going to go take a shower. to warm myself up. And I went in and I turned on the shower and I'm waiting for it to get hot. And then I push the thing that makes the shower be a shower instead of a tub. And the tub faucet just shot off. And there was this like super hot water going to the back of the room. And for a minute, I was no longer anxious about coming and giving the talk. Instead, I was wondering who I should call to take care of this. So there was sort of a thing about shock. One shock driving out another, the way the Buddha instructs sometimes if you have one worry, you should drive it out with a different one, like using a peg, a wooden peg to drive out another wooden peg. And I'd like to invite you to picture me leaning over the tub fully clothed, and exposed is how I am right now, sort of. But I also am not in the place as a writer where I thought I would be when I signed up to do this whole series of things. And I want to talk a little bit about that in terms of, because I said I would talk about narratives of power and things like that, and I'll get around more to this at the end, but I had imagined, I'm looking at the camera too, because that'll be better for the video. When I said I'm coming to Smith more than maybe a year ago or last year sometime, I thought I would have this novel in press that I had been writing for about 10 years, and I finished it. And for once I was flirting with a more explicitly Buddhist content for the work that I was doing, like to have some Buddhists and their problems and dramas be the topic of the work. So, you know, in Buddhist, there can be Buddhist fiction that isn't about Buddhists, but is infused with some sort of Buddhist, way of perceiving, and maybe I'll talk about that. But also one with Buddhist content, and I thought maybe our culture is ready for this, and I could do this and have people who meditate, and you know, a teacher and their wife and that kind, and their partner, and a sangha and all their gyrations and silly things, and have it be humorous and stuff. And then my literary agent really did not like it at all. And so I don't have a book that I can have in press and read from even exactly. So I'm, and then I'm seeing this word eminent Buddhist writer, which is like, oh God, not how I was feeling at the time. So, but then I almost considered saying that I was going to be sick, not come. So that's a story, right? There's a narration, and you guys are laughing in some kind of possibly embarrassed recognition of the vulnerability of things. Like a lot of times writers will say, well, this happened and that happened, and then I told my agent this and I withdrew it, and you come to the talk at the time when it's all resolved, but it's not resolved. I only recently decided that I would continue to work with that novel and that agent at all. So this is the place that I'm in now. Maybe emanating rather than being eminent or something, I don't know. So what I view as being like fiction or stories can be a way one hopes to connect with each other. And as Ruth said in her talk, we're all beings who have senses and a mind, which in the Buddhist, practice and philosophy is considered to be another sense. And being alive and with a mind, I can tell you about the tub nozzle and the hot water and different crises and, sort of the ups and downs of life. And hopefully it is a story that we all can share and recognize that through your minds, your sixth sense to say, you can hear these words and maybe feel some kind of jangling around inside yourself. Something empathic or something that connects or something that may enlarge you. And just to say that even speaking is a kind of activity of mind and senses too, that I'm making sounds and symbols in a language that we supposedly share, and it will enter your continuum in some way and touch and evoke other senses and memories and things like that. It's really quite amazing. That I've mentioned 6 senses, but if you count all the senses that are alive in this room right now, it would be a lot. And there's different numbers of senses that are getting, articulated and named anatomically, but, we should leave it at that, I think, at this point. So as a writer, as a fiction writer, I'm writing as an embodied person with a heart and a mind, but also to be a writer is dependent on other people. And your ability to listen or receive or understand messages about this complicated life we share as human beings, and how do we live together on this day through people who care about words and how they work on us, and how they work on life itself. So I'm really thinking about those things in my work, in my life as a teacher or as a practitioner of writing and meditation. So I'm not where I thought I would be, but I'm here. So to address a little bit Buddhist writing, to say that what we'd call Buddhism is a religion that's from India, and the founder of it, you think Buddhism is named after the founder, but that person's personal name wasn't Buddha, it was something else. And this person was named by their followers a name that means awake, and apparently can also be used for the sound of a rooster crowing in the morning, Bodhi. I don't know, the scholars in the room may have other thoughts about this, I'm not sure. But Buddhism didn't become one thing until colonialism happened, and both named it from all these traditions together named it from the outside, but also colonialism created a reason for people in Asia, like Thailand and Burma that I'm familiar with, to organize themselves around being Buddhist, to resist being seen from the outside, and to emphasize seeing themselves in their own way through their own traditions. In fact, the Thai king at the time, Mongkut, I think his name was, sent emissaries to the Vatican to study what the Christians were doing, not to imitate what Christians were doing, but to forestall the objections that Christians might have to the paganism in Thailand, so they could organize themselves to not get missionized, to sort of look good enough that they wouldn't receive the unwelcome missionary impulse of the Pope. So given all of that, what I've received as Buddhism is a tradition of a type of really energized introspection that has an ethical taste to it, that's a very skillful, I think, set of practices that have inflected and infected, let's say, my own life in a positive way, to look at what my mind does in a really, what seems to be a lot more clear kind of way than I would have had access to otherwise. So it's a practice or a skill rather than a thing is what it feels like most usefully. And it's helped me to interrogate things that I learned from my family, stories that come through the culture, and to sort of see what they feel like, how they land, and whether they kind of make sense or not, as best I can. So I'd like to offer you this exercise about Buddhist fiction, or a Buddhist exercise about fiction, and imagine that, let's say, each one of you is with me in the kitchen of our house, of a house, or we're maybe in the same house, and I have access to the refrigerator where the apples are kept, and you say, could I get an apple? Because I'm standing close to the refrigerator, I give you one. And you turn it over and you see that this apple has a big rotten spot on it. So from there, since I'm not in your mind, I just invite you to imagine what you felt and said to yourself or to me when I gave you the rotten apple. What's that? So this is an exercise from a Burmese teacher that I have. So I don't know, is anyone willing to say what popped into your head when you imagined that? Like, if you went along with the exercise enough? Yeah.
First thing that popped into my head was, I'll cut it out and put it in the compost.
Right. So it wasn't that, you're not that mad at me or anything? No.
It happens.
Right, but you still had a consequence therefrom, yeah. So one more, or a couple more, yeah. See.
What popped into my head was a question of, like, would I ask her to hand me a different apple, or would I just sort of wait for her to walk away so she wouldn't notice me sneaking into the fridge to get a different apple? I just assumed you didn't know it was rotten.
Right. There's one more. You had one.
I just have that same moment of ambivalence. Would I say something? Would I not say something?
Oh, you guys are so polite and nice. you're not like white. Oh yeah, one more.
Well, first, two things. I would assume that you meant well, that you weren't trying to give me a rotten apple. But I would say something. I'd say, oh, you probably didn't notice this.
Right.
So maybe there's others in there in the fridge that are also rotten. You'd want to know about.
Thanks. Thanks, all of you. Wow, you're all really nice. Like, you're not like, why are you always buying those damn apples on sale? You know, they always rot within a day, or what a waste, or why do I always get the rotten apple? Like it's got to be me that gets it, or those things. Anyway, just to say that this is kind of where Buddhism starts to look at the fictions that go on in our minds. Like, you can think about how overall, if we took this exercise and tried to transpose it into the future, like there might not be apples, there might not be refrigerators, it might feel really something, you know, all kinds of other things can stem from this, like remembering the creation myth of Adam and Eve and what supposedly went wrong according to some people with that apple. Like if this story was being studied in some future period, those connections might be made and someone might start getting a professorship based on those, I don't know. Or to say, like, what does our mind fill space with at different times? Like this morning, a friend of mine called who hadn't heard from their child, who was a grown-up child who hadn't called them in a while. And because this person had not my friend, but their child has had troubles in the past, they called me up because they were worrying and they kind of wanted to talk to somebody. And we talked a little bit also about how, you know, maybe I was suffering from imposter syndrome or you know, those things. And we shared kind of what was a little bit, you know, vulnerable for each of us. And during the call, the situation with the child was resolved. My friend's child was accompanying the grandchild to a wrestling championship. So it was actually not a problem. It was sort of a triumphal thing that was happening. But so then my friend and I wrapped up by saying, they said to me, I never worry about you if you don't call me. Why was that? Is because we trust each other. You know, that sometimes if somebody doesn't call you or respond in time, I imagine they're mad at me, I've done something wrong, or something's wrong with them. You know, the space fills up with all these things, you know, which is true of a friend or even like a large group that you don't hear from for some time. What does the culture fill those silences with? But my friend doesn't worry if I don't call because we're pretty close. She knows that I would call if I really needed to help in some way. And she also figures that I'm kind of busy with my stuff and that I don't need her to call me to make sure I'm okay either. So there's a lot of conditions that touch on what our mind fills silent spaces with. So what our mind projects into our world. So imperfectly as I can ever do it, Buddhist practice helps me to start to see some of those things, like how I fill space and how other people might fill space, and knowing that I fill space with things that aren't reliable, that are coming probably out of my past and my history. Other people are doing the same thing. So this also helps me when I'm writing fiction or writing character or listening to people project their fears or their anger into the public conversation, thinking about kind of all those things about how our mind continually works. So in the preface that I wrote to a book in 2004, which was an anthology of Buddhist fiction, at the time I was making some time because my editor had gotten fired and then their publishing house got bought. And so I had this interim project that someone came up to me and said, would you like to collect an anthology of Buddhist fiction? And I got rid of the idea that to be Buddhist fiction has to have Buddhist content because I didn't want to deal with that at the time. And I said that Buddhist fiction is too problematic to solidify because from the point of view of fiction, the story is just a story. It can be like a satisfying story or a not so satisfying story, well written or innovative. And then further, I said, from the Buddhist point of view, if you invent stories that are full of characters who love and fight and die, without ever having truly existed. This redoubles the same mistake that lies at the heart of our suffering. Before I return to that, I'll say that I went on to say that when you're a fiction writer, you don't say like they were sad. You have someone go out and yell at the driver of the truck who's delivering a porta potty to the construction site next door where a new house is being built to replace the one where that burned down and the neighbor was killed last April, kind of thing. And that's how you say someone was sad, because you want to trick people and construct something into which the person who's reading can kind of feel their way in and make a discovery rather than just being told. And it's funny because it's been long enough ago that that example was actually autobiographical for me in 2004. The house next door did burn down and the neighbor was killed, and a new set of houses was built there with people that I'm not really friends with. In fact, I think because of the way the houses were constructed, but that's another long story. But to say that I have come to disagree with myself about whether narrative is an existential mistake, I think it's a projection. And we're always projecting a kind of imaginary internal person of ourself and an imaginary external person of other people. But the existential mistake is more subtle. It's to say that it's all, we feel how real it is, and we feel that it's really permanent and fixed. That it's really, that the way it is now is the way it's always going to be, or the way that we have to be, based on the way that we enter into relationship with our thinking. So to say that, like I was sitting meditating and I was looking at the tree outside, and it took about 3 or 4 thoughts to get from the tree outside to the imminent death of the ecosphere, like the terror of global climate change. And then about 4 more thoughts away, I was angry with someone because they had edited an email that I sent out a week ago saying, will everyone please edit this because we have to send it out. And they was editing it today after I said it was ready to send out, like that. And then I suddenly remembered a Buddhist teaching, because I was thinking about Buddhist teachings, and I remembered that being angry isn't necessarily helpful, since I could just say to that person, go ahead and edit it and then you send it out and it'll still be fine. Why was it helping me to be that irritated with someone who was speaking at the wrong time? Let's say, if you sort of boil it down. So sometimes I think this kind of practice can really help us get to a place where we can see the facts and not sort of continue like, I probably wouldn't have written that person a mean email, but at some point I might have. At least luckily I didn't have to feel that burning feeling of annoyance because my mind remembered something that came in to say, like, you don't have to do that. So this Buddha that we're talking about spoke about himself at one point when someone was saying, I really want to see you and understand you. He said, well, enough of this. Why do you want to see me? If you see the laws of nature, you've seen enough of me. And if you've seen me, you've seen the laws of nature. Do you think my body is permanent? Do you think this body is a body that's engaged with suffering? Is it contingent and not self? Whether I'm awakened or not, because I'm born, I'm going to die, he sort of said. There's a paraphrase from some different sutras. And, that's a kind of packaged lesson that sounds really intense and almost cruel or very dry to say, like, I'm not anybody, don't see me, don't hang on to me, just don't cling to me, and don't think that I'm a person. Like, I don't want to be that person to you. But then when I think about it now in terms of one of the themes that I did say I would talk about in this talk is that this person is a spiritual leader. This person is saying, like, you should see what I'm trying to teach and don't solidify me as someone, like, don't externalize into thinking that in order to be liberated yourself, you need to keep attached to this person. I want you to learn what I'm saying. So when I think about my own position now as a leader and teacher, I think about how much it is of importance to step aside and make room for other people either to lead or also to feel themselves into where they are, rather than kind of holding this quality of power or authority in a way that sort of creates a duality. So when, dry as it sounds, when he's saying this, I hear the depth of his compassion toward the student and his willingness to create a kind of succession. But that same teaching can happen, say, in fictional ways. I would say Ruth's novel's title is For the Time Being, and her one of her young characters is called Now. So that would be a way that, you know, you could say the same thing in a much less didactic way, which is what I think fiction is about, is it sort of uses the kind of attraction and allure of the way we like to get entranced into stories to teach things without necessarily saying that you're teaching them. Like I have a friend named Justin who invented an art installation to have people meditate without ever being told how. That you enter this room and it has to do with the way that you breathe. Like the room starts to make music if you breathe in a certain way. And since you want to hear the music, you have to be aware of where the music's coming from and that it's related to yourself breathing, and that when people leave the room, they feel that they've entered into a quality of their own presence without having to worry if they're doing it right, the way people worry if they're doing it right when they hear an instruction of how you should do something immediately. You could start to do it wrong, maybe, because of the way that words work. But in fiction, the seduction that you enter with that seems to work so that when you feel preached at, the fiction isn't working anymore. When you feel told a little bit too heavily why something is the way it is, and there's some artistry in reducing that. So I'm going to skip a little bit here and think about how it's of interest to read about characters who are, you know, not perfect, who learn things through their lives, when I'm writing about characters, I have to sort of love them, even if I don't like them. You know, I have to kind of feel that way about them. There's, like, sometimes to say that, you know, it's fun to write a really kind of mean, evil character that pushes things along. That's usually what they're good for, because they're the people that don't think twice about, you know, their motivations or anything like that. And so they create things that the more ordinary or dimensional characters have to respond to. That's quite fun. So I don't always I do sort of love the mean characters. And I think it's maybe because of that, because I would like to be less sort of hesitant in applying my will to things, something like that. But to go back to talking a little bit about the Buddhist tradition and narratives in the Buddhist tradition, like there's a story that the Buddha supposedly told, which I like very much, and the teaching that entered my mind when I was angry was this thing called the simile of the saw, and some of you may have heard of it. Like, there's a teaching that says even if you're being sawn in half with a two-handled saw, and you start to feel angry, you would not be, doing my teaching. That would not be an example of following these practices. So, like, of course, it sounds like an incredibly insane demand that if someone's sawing you in half, you would not get mad, But I think when you look at sort of the intention of the person who's telling that story, and you read the whole story that was outside of that story, the teaching starts to get more interesting. First of all, it bothers you enough that you should start to think about what does that mean and stuff. Like, if you're not going to just reject it out of hand and say that I'm not going to ever practice anything that tells me shit like this because it's not going to help me. Like, if somebody's sawing me in half, I want them to stop sawing me in half, and getting angry is going to help me stop them. But it's an image that stays in your head in such a way that you might have to start worrying about it. And then to read the story that the image is embedded in. The story is that there's a monk who's sort of a sweet guy, and he starts hanging around with the women ordained people, the nuns. He's hanging around with the nuns much too much. And people are criticizing the nuns, and he's getting really angry about it. And then people start criticizing him because he's angry. Then the nuns are getting angry. So as usually happens in these situations, and they come to the Buddha to report on this and ask for some advice. And the Buddha says various things, but one of the things he starts doing is he tells the guy, like, I don't want you to get so angry when the nuns are being criticized. Like, please don't do that. It's not my teaching. And then he starts telling this story about, in some translations, it's a slave woman. In some translations, it's a servant who her fellow servants are envious of because her mistress is so nice to her. And so they say, well, this person who's in power is really sweet, and you're lucky to have such a nice mistress. And the slave person says, her name is Kali, which means dark, so there's some interesting things kind of woven in this narrative. And the dark person says, I'll show you just how nice my mistress is. I'm going to do an experiment. And she starts staying in bed in the morning and not getting out of bed. And then the mistress says, where are you? You're supposed to be scrubbing the kitchen or something. Are you okay? Are you sick? And Kali says, no, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just in bed. And I'll get up when I want to. And she extends this to the point where the mistress or the employer hits her on the head with a rolling pin, and then she goes out in the street and says, see, my mistress is not really as nice as you say. She's only nice when things happen the way she wants them to happen. And after that, the simile of the saw is uttered on top of this. So it's a sort of a fiction on top of a fiction. And embedded in the story that seems to be about, passively putting up with being sawn in half is this whole story about resistance. And it's not explicit, but I imagine that the Buddha was also saying the nuns can take care of themselves. I wish that the canon would have continued to hold some thread like that in which the Buddha would say, well, people shouldn't be criticizing the nuns and, something like that, but it doesn't. But somehow this story has come down to us enough that I think a lot about that little servant story and the class distinctions that are in it, the agency and the wisdom or the intelligence in that story being brought by someone who's in a subordinate position. And I'm not quite sure that we can say that this is a, instruction about being completely passive anymore. Also, that this simile of the saw is such a bright message. It sort of cuts through different layers of my brain so that when I carry it and worry about it, it helps me to see that it doesn't necessarily help me, for example, to remain in complete reactivity about the stuff my agent said to me around my book. Like, that if I start saying that, stuff the agent said is really crazy. Like, she said, I wouldn't go to a retreat in real life, therefore I don't want to go to a retreat on the first page of your book. And I don't want to hear about the problems of people who have problems because they adhere to this obscure religious sect that you are part of, and, et cetera. So in order to, really see what was helpful for me in the simile of the saw is that to just, get upset about that or feel really hurt or damned or like I really fucked up, to look at what, start to take out pieces from what I was just told and see what was what is kind of like unpacking a large suitcase because it's complicated. So from here to say that as a fiction writer, I've been talking quite a bit, so I'm going to try to sort of round myself up and talk about where fiction writing now enters the market through a commercial sort of audience and an established group of things like agents and publishers and self-publishers and blogs and stuff like that. So after the election of the 45th president, something happened to fiction, says Lucy Ives in Baffler magazine. I don't mean the concept of fiction as distinguished from facts. While newspapers benefited mildly from new subscribers urgently wishing to be better informed, about just what the hell was going on. Sales of novels, that once profitable form of fiction, continued to decrease in 2017 and have been doing so ever since. So artifice, fantasy, fiction, and allegory outside novels have grown to hysterical proportions and broadcast on an insane loop. And the word narrative now seems to mostly be about how to allure people into your business model, I've noticed. They have a lot to do with product placement. And yet, to say, like, do we still have some kind of hunger for a narrative that has meaning or that has some kind of usefulness within our life about how we got here and what we might do next or what we might do in our process and about our process? Right? So I can think that this book that I was writing enters a market where there's something else my agent said is that there were a lot fewer sales going on, and that a person like myself who sold fewer than 20,000 copies of their previous book has a harder time getting in now. And they laid out a kind of example of stuff that they wanted me to do, which I tried to do, and then they liked it even less, let's say. So that was really strange. So in the end, I had to sort of sit down and see if I wanted to continue at all with this book. And it hasn't been a process of anything working out very neatly, and I'm still in it, I would say, that I had to unpack everything and decide whether I was going to be in reaction to this critique, what the story meant to me coming from the inside. And when I started talking to some friends about the story itself, they said I looked actually pretty happy and amused by the story as I was narrating it to them. So they watched the change on my face, and then we came out with a type of a strategy, both for the narrative and the outer trajectory of the book. Because they listened, because they were interested to help me with that, it gave a type of extra buoyancy in the process that I wouldn't have had on my own. So they're, in a way, they're a type of readers of the process that I'm in now, which is a process with a story and around a story and my story. So it was really quite sweet that has taken place. And being here is also part of that, since I took part of the next step was to write something, and then I took it to some people from the 5 colleges here, and they helped me some, and they listened, and they didn't kick me out or make me go home or anything like that. So there I have another piece to start with, and then I shall try to read something on Thursday about it. So within all of these sort of different levels of narrative, I'm hoping that I've said something about the need for a kind of, empathy with one another and empathy within a human process. One of the things that I learned while here is about at least 900-year-old debate about whether the Buddha can see relative reality. How old is that debate? Is it, right? Right? It's old. Well, it's been going on for thousands of years, right? And I'm not sure that I would want the Buddha not to be able to see relative reality. I was talking, my other friend called today too and said they're working with their mother who is losing the ability to orient in real life and becoming very paranoid and accusing people of things and all that sort of deterioration of memory and personality that happens late in life. And my friend is their child, and so is saying, his quote was, "I wish I could remember that I don't need to climb into the crazy car with my mom all the time." But what if we don't kind of climb into the crazy car with each other? What could you really connect? I don't know. I'm not sure. And if you can't really connect with where another person is, even if it means climbing into the crazy car, I think we need to be able to climb in and climb out. That's what I can see from where I'm sitting, that we climb in together and then we climb out together or alone, and we don't want to go all the way into what you'd call the crazy car of harmful projections and that kind of thing. But I think it's important to share that quality of vulnerability there. So let's say if I need to persuade some of my readers to go to a retreat in fiction, I probably have to write a few chapters before I throw you in, but I hope to be able to do that at some point. Just to see what I want to say to complete it. When I was in the bookstore the other day, I can't not go to bookstores and can't not buy books whenever I go to a new place. I feel like the bookstore needs my support and stuff. And I was reading blurbs on the back to see what the blurbs said about the books. And I noticed that about 3 blurbs in a row said, these characters are irrevocably changed by, their time in a wagon train or different things like that, and whatever it was. Their efforts to free some slaves, there are these things. And I thought about irrevocable changes, and it's like to read about people going through irrevocable changes kind of satisfies us somehow. And what I think we're also hoping when we write or communicate is that some of those changes come about not because we live them ourselves, but because we hear about how other people live them, or how even fictional characters may live them. And that that's an important thing for us as, in this life that we have together, to think about that, like how that works. Okay, so this is time to end the talk, and what I'm hoping is that this discussion of empathy and construction, fabrication and deconstruction has entangled with you in some way that feel fruitful. I didn't manage to talk about Thomas Hardy because I had to skip that part, but if you want to know it, you can ask in the Q&A. But be happy to hear any remarks from you. Oh, yeah.
Say something about Thomas Hardy.
Okay. It's about, it was about the vulnerability of not knowing, and in fictional characters, and giving an example of, Thomas Hardy has a lot of sort of mechanical things that happen. So someone forgives someone else in a letter, like his name is Klim. He forgives his errant wife, Eustacia Vi, for killing his mother and adultery and other things, and slides a letter under the door, but she doesn't get it. So then she goes off and kills herself. Because not only does she not know, but she doesn't know that she doesn't know. So there's something satisfying about reading that, even if it's in a clunky way. Like you sort of go, oh no, what a terrible thing. And these are novels about very rigid social forms and how crushing they are, and that Hardy wrote at the end of this really tragic book where nobody's really he actually writes a slightly happy ending, and then he disclaims it and says, well, they made me do it. The publisher made me put a happy ending on this, and if you have a more austere imagination, you'll know what really happened to these people. Yeah, thanks for asking. So happy endings seem to sell better than unhappy ones, but sometimes, entering into the suffering of someone else helps you know what not to do, or what to deplore, or what to beware of, and stuff like that. Yeah.
How do dreams or dreaming factor into your writing, into your own experience?
Sometimes I don't write long about dreams unless they function somehow in the story. If I'm writing a fictional story, like I've written a couple of dreams in, and usually it's a way of slightly breaking out of the linear piece to bring in something more symbolic that the character is experiencing. But usually I remember one dream that I wrote was that someone was covered with hair and they were suckling from a wolf's breast or something like that, just to really show something about the wild side of what was going on under the surface, like that. What about you, or why are you asking that? I'm curious.
I guess I've been thinking about it a lot myself. How it's easy for us to get caught up in all the details of life, but then I think some understandings of what is going on, maybe on the subconscious level, on the emotional
Right.
level, can come out in dreams. And also, I've been thinking about how it's important in Buddhism, in narrative Buddhist narratives, can be stuff that's important, or
Right.
in relationships between teachers and students.
Right. Yeah, like one of my teachers says, the dreams that you have just before you wake up tend to be more significant than the ones you have earlier in the night, kind of thing. Like the just before waking ones tend to have more significant content. That was very articulate for the same kind of thing I was saying about the subconscious dynamics can sort of crystallize something. It can be fun to bring in that kind of image as a writer too. One thing about dreams is like what doesn't work for me in fiction or in thinking about dreams. It's like one of the things about dreams is that they don't seem like dreams. When you're dreaming them, they seem real, and that's sort of a Buddhist idea that like our reality seems real, and that's why it's like a dream, not because dreams are like a woo-woo sort of thing, but because they seem so actual when we're engaged in them in that way.
Do you have any kind of thoughts about the Buddhist perspective on your nonfiction and travel writing?
On mine?
Yeah, I mean,
I have a lot of different things that I've written, so I'm not sure about the ones that you're thinking about, like about travel writing.
like your Outside magazine piece.
Uh-huh. Which one?
With the fight.
Fist of God?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a Buddhist thing that informs any of that?
Thanks for that question. I know I have to think about it. Can I explain what the piece is? I've done a lot of traveling, and I did, for a period, I was doing quite a bit of like adventure travel writing and going to quite remote places, especially in Latin America. And this was a festival that a friend of mine told me about that happens in the Altiplano in Peru. And basically it's the people from the valley and the people from the mountain meet once a year, and they really literally slug it out. Sometimes people die. I actually think I did see someone get killed, the second one I went to, because people will fall, they'll fall down, or men and women participate in this, and there's brass knuckles, there's helmets, there's rocks. It's scary. One spiritual teacher that I presented this to, which sort of seems to be, if you were to have a Buddhist perspective about it, is that conflicts arise between people, whether it's about a belated email or where your cow went or something like that. And people who live on the higher parts of this area had a harder time living than the people in the valley. So there's inevitably, in Spanish, pueblo chico, infierno grande, small village, large hell, And if you don't have a lot of other mechanisms, maybe just fighting it out once a year gets it off your chest. So it's a clearing process. It's also a very ancient practice that's all through the Americas. There are stories about twins, there's wrestling in the Amazon and stuff. So I don't know if it should all be boiled into making a Buddhist point exactly, but about how do humans negotiate our differences by knowing that next year there'll be another contest and it might not be me that loses next time, something like that.
And at the end, everybody's good friends, I guess.
Yeah, something gets settled. They all really drink a lot too after. Somebody challenged me. I write out in there, a person challenged me. They said something very insulting, and I considered joining the tradition, and then I thought, I better not. Like, it would probably be better to just say, yeah. She said I was a whore. She said, "Butai!" She said, I'm like, no. Anyway, that was meant to be engaging. It was kind of an invitation. I felt it as both friendly and trying to talk about what was I doing there. It was a little piece of both.
As a fiction writer, are you conscious of yourself as creating truth?
Truth? That would be a hope that I have. But it's only a kind of truth, right? It can only be a kind of truth. It has to have a ring to it. It has to have a feeling that this person would or wouldn't do this, or something like that, or this situation would be like this or wouldn't be like this. And I think I was going to give this, I've changed the title of this talk a whole bunch of times, but I was going to talk about the writer's 5 hindrances in terms of the Buddhist understanding. Like if you want something to sound a certain way too much, or you're too afraid to say it, or something like that, that what I try to monitor in myself are those forces that kind of, if I'm pushing too much for something to fit, it has to sort of fit rather than that. So it's more like, that's where I feel the balance. Yeah. But sometimes, just a second, I'll come around. What was it? The story in the novel that I'm writing is about someone who starts to invent an enlightened person and stuff like that. And pretty soon I got an email from someone who said that they were talking to someone who was writing a novel about someone who had not quite invented an enlightened person, but was channeling a goddess. And it was like, sometimes there's this funny feeling that I write about something and then something will happen that sounds a lot like what I wrote, even though I didn't expect it to. And that is strange when that happens. I think it may be just that I'm set up to see it. But anyway. Hi.
I just wondered what other Buddhist fiction writers you would praise or draw our attention to apart from Luther Zeki?
Well, John Burdett, I really like. There aren't really so many, as far as I know. Can you think of one?
No, I'm ignorant. That's why I came to do.
This is my weakness as a writer, and why I probably don't teach writing is that I have a terrible memory for questions like that. And I had a list of them in the prologue, but it's a slight. Oh, you know what? Here's another one. Now I have memory lapse, but that Lincoln in the Bardo is a really good one. Yeah. Right, George Saunders. Has he given a reading around here? Yeah. That's a really good one. And if you were willing to give me your contact information, my list of favorites would come up over the next 24 hours easily, as it will not right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Love your characters. Do they take life, take their own path?
Right.
Do they, in other words, do they boss you around? Do they, how does that work? Is there?
Right. I think it's different for different writers, For me, it's more like the work itself, like the overall novel or whatever I've created bosses me around, and it's not easy. A lot of the time it's like, when I start to write, it's like I have this metaphor that it's like, I don't know if you're all of this age, but do you remember the Incredible Hulk, who was like a normal person, and then they go through this thing where their clothes all rip and they're like, ah! It's a little bit like that, that something inside starts to move around in a way that's not always. The transition is not comfortable of entering into the state where the whole work is alive, something like that. But I do start to feel the people in the book as if they were real people, kind of, and to know them like that. But then sometimes I change them, then I don't know, are changed by me even after they were someone, then they become someone else. But they're not as autonomous as I wish. Like entering into the state of being in a flow as a writer might feel different, and it's not always a flow. Like sometimes there's a lot of artificiality there, and then there's a flow, and then there's more artificial work like that. I think that's kind of what you're asking, is it?
Yeah, I'm not even sure what I was really asking.
Yeah.
It's just intriguing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you handle the kind of the suffering of your characters. I mean, as a Buddhist practitioner, one is certainly aware of the suffering of the world, and your characters suffer.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, how easy do you let them out of their suffering?
I mean, I feel like you have to be willing to torture them a little bit. Or no, it wouldn't be a fictional narrative in the tradition that we have now. It would just be a fantasy escape, and there would be nothing to. I guess that what I was maybe saying about the crazy car is that there would be nothing to connect to other human beings with, since we're all in the crazy car off and on, or, you know. So one of my very serious monk friends used to say, fiction writing is only and all about suffering. It's only and all ever about suffering. And I don't think it's only that, but I think that there has to be that as, so where I would go with it is that maybe this is related to the one about love, like compassion for them, loving them and feeling their suffering and knowing that, like, we're all just, was it nosing around or rubbing, trying to get through it, like rubbing around in here, you know, like as a person. Like maybe that thing about not where the Buddha said he's not solidifying himself either. Like as long as you can be awakened, but when you're born, there's going to be suffering and you're going to die. Like that's a ground that is really hard to get off from. And if your characters aren't suffering, I feel like then from the way that I write, you're falsifying something. I don't know, even the best of them. Yeah. But then sometimes I think that one of the reasons it took me so long to write this book is that everyone was suffering so much and I could hardly stand it. And I might have to change, I might have to pull back on that a little bit, yeah.
I was thinking about trying to define Buddhist fiction. And the thought that occurred to me is that all good fiction is Buddhist fiction. Maybe there's some fiction that isn't so good, that doesn't capture what it means to be human. Right. But if it's good fiction, it captures what it means to be human, and that's Buddhism to me. Right. So.
I think that's beautiful. That's like saying, you know, you see the natural law, or it's human, but it's also not owned by Buddhism. Right. You know, like it's certainly not owned by Buddhism at all. Like, one of my friends said, have you been watching, you know, some of the ceremonies and stuff in New Zealand and the love that's being expressed and the kinds of ways that people are responding from the heart and, you know, with real beauty to understand and carry this process. That's sort of the Muslim community and people supporting each other however we do. So I don't want to claim that necessarily as only a Buddhist thing. But I guess, you know, what I would claim as Buddhist is like, or claim that is there in Buddhism is wondering, you know, where our narratives are going and what our stories are pointing towards. So, like, I think Marcus Garvey said something like, people can't be free unless they know they can be. You know, and it's important to think about what you're pointing to. So I was using this example of Hardy, saying that there's a lot of deplore, and tragedy. And, you know, I guess when you read it, you have to say that all these social arrangements are terrible and they're crushing people. And that's where you find the liberation, is saying, I'm not going to do that. But if there isn't some sense of loving your characters or wholeness and in the narrative, you can go all different ways with it. Like, they don't have to have a happy ending, but I feel like there has to be something about, you know, liberation, freedom, wisdom, something like that.
suffering, yet benign to the meek and mighty kind.
Say that again?
Life is suffering, yet benign to the meek and the mighty kind.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But I also have a rhetorical question. What color is the gray area that separates genius from madness? April Fool?
Gray. What color is the gray area? Is gray. Well, I think it like madness or dreams or those things, like as a Buddhist teacher, there's ways that breakdown is necessary, you know, or that can contain some real wisdom or sensitivity. And I don't think that anyone who breaks down like loses their validity as a person. Like in fiction, I was taught that you don't write from the point of view of an insane person because it's sort of they're off in their own space and, you know, they're not acting to be irrevocably changed in their actions because you sort of take it off into some other realm. But in the human realm, or from what I understand, it's like sometimes that type of madness. I mean, I don't think of genius as being like a great idea to carry around because that separates someone off to be like really special, and like so much like cultural production and artistry is done by people who don't have a name or don't sign their work or that kind of thing. So I'd ask that question too. But this book, what was it called? Breaking Down is Waking Up is a book I'm just reading that where it said, you know, when you take the silhouette of a face, like you can make a mold of a face and then it's either 3D pointing in or pointing out. Do you know what I mean? Like if it's you've seen that picture of a mask, like, and sometimes it looks like it's pointing in or pointing out. And schizophrenic people are able to see whether it's pointing in and pointing out better than people who are supposedly normal. So there's a line between abilities that you might have if you're very, very sensitive, you know, that you might see things certain ways that you don't, that a person who has this ordinary consciousness where you have a bunch of perceptions and you put them together along a line that would be standard and help you negotiate this crazy world. Like some people who are crazy, maybe, you know, there's something about what's going on with them that is also worth noting and valuing rather than, so I guess it's some question about value.
Right.
You know?
Like relative reality and then augmented reality and virtual reality and meditation reality.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's times in meditation where you really do go crazy. Like, hopefully then you come back together after, and it's not, how painful is the state you're in? That's important. Painful or not, anyway. I can't really answer that question. It's not a definitive answer anyway. Maybe one more?
That
I guess.
first question about dreaming, and you responded that dreams are often an analogy used in Buddhist teaching to how we take things to be real, and they're really just, there's something else, they're not as real as we think take them to be.
Right.
Does that same process happen with writing fiction? Does it kind of illuminate that, and do you think that can serve that role as well? It can be a different kind of analogy, maybe an experiential one.
I think so, yeah. Like, one of the things I was thinking while I was writing this is like you project yourself into a character that, you know they never really existed, probably, but you can sort of feel what kind of things that person is like, and maybe you have, a repertory of types of people that you're familiar with and they fit there somewhere, but you learn something by leaving your own set of patterns and feeling into how someone else is. Then when you come back, you're not hopefully completely the same, So it's something, right, like that.
For you as a writer and also for the readers, you can both go through that.
Yeah, I hope.
Yeah.
I felt very vindicated when I was a Radcliffe Fellow, and this biologist said to me that she didn't feel as intelligent when she wasn't reading novels. I thought, that's so nice, since the sciences are supposed to be so smart, right?
Just kind of the connected question, because we repeated a few times that really wonderful question to start with, what does the mind fill space with? And it sounded as if your answer right now is projection,
Mm-hmm.
at least by that example that each of us would come up with what we, in the answer to the apple,
Right.
rotten apple question, that you would always fill it with projection. And I'm just curious to know, is that your thinking? I mean, it sounds like projection is really what your model is right now about what the mind, or is
Right.
the idea that we should try not to, that we should recognize its projection and try to empty our minds of that.
Well, to be like Buddhist and sort of mean or something, like the projections are empty anyway. That the space is full of space, but I guess you could say that we do, we're sort of arising out of the past, let's say, or our past, and different kinds of collective things, or things that we know and remember and stuff like that. So that's what we use to sort of imagine the future or explain things. And there is a Buddhist philosophical teaching called dependent origination that is like that, that how we experience things is conditioned by different kinds of factors. And we would like to intervene in ways that, like the toxic kinds of projections or harmful ones are reduced, and some of the more, better ones are supported. But yeah, I would say projection is kind of a technical word. But I do think that if you just sit long enough, you'll see your mind just does all kinds of stuff. Like the stuff it does is crazy. And it's different for every person. Like, I was thinking about the number of thought bubbles in this room. If you could count them, we wouldn't be able to breathe, like that. But I think what I was also saying is that certain kinds of gaps make us uncomfortable, or can feel uncomfortable, and then what projects into that is often really interesting. The first teaching I did as a Buddhist teacher was with a psychoanalyst, and gaps and being late and losing your keys and all that stuff was a place where he would usually drill into people around what's really going on with you. Do you spend longer or shorter doing what you're supposed to do? Like, why? And so stuff like that. It's just of interest, I think. Okay, well, maybe one more question, or like one more. Does anyone didn't say anything yet, or want to feel encouraged? Yeah.
I kind of have two that I've been ruminating on, and one of them is so you like problematic characters, and I'm kind of wondering if we can learn as if we were experiencing that character's own suffering without ourselves having to be like vicariously traumatized by what they're going through, but that we can come out on the other side like wiser and
Yeah.
I think you've talked a lot about that and how helpful that can be. And then my other one is kind of unrelated, but I just don't know much about the editing world. And I'm surprised how much they are almost like censoring what is on the shelves in terms of like, I don't know, sometimes as a writer, I feel like my first instinct is really good with a lot of things. And I also want to like keep it, whether it's an outline or a first chapter. And I'm totally identified with your struggle of someone telling you what to do, and you're like, that wasn't the purpose of my,
Right. Thank you for identifying with that. I mean, what does it take to join the public conversation? And do we want to do what that takes? So there's all these forces out there crashing together. So when I had this difficult conversation with my agent, she was also saying, I have a really hard time getting anything through the eye of this needle. So just, follow what I'm saying and we'll try to get it through. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it the way she said at all. It just got worse. And I think it was also because it wasn't as authentic of a restructuring from my point of view. I was trying to do what someone else was telling me to do. So it didn't work. And it might not, in the end, work. I don't know.
I think writers like channel from their ancestral memory a lot.
Yeah.
And I find that's really helpful in Buddhist writing, especially to hear stories that almost come from somewhere else.
Yeah. That's what we hope for when we're writing, is to access that kind of slightly deeper level. And we did a faculty seminar that was kind of like a retreat where I read some things like that about, you know, you hope that it can come from a place that is kind of a deep part of yourself to write and express, you know, like that. It's important. And then you do have to trim away stuff like, you know, I remember one of my editors said, like, my editors from Outside Magazine, she would always say, I know this is your favorite part, and because it's your favorite part, I'm going to take it out and see if this story still works without your favorite part. And so we got into this cat and mouse game where I would hide my favorite part. And I would say, like, I bet you think you know which one is my favorite part, but I put it there in such a way that you can't tell. And I won in the end. But it's, I think, like that. You know, there's a trickery to it too. Like, okay, I'm going on and on. I'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll stop. But there's a sutta where the Buddha is talking about, he says, imagine if a magician or a magician's apprentice were to set up a magic show at a place where two roads cross, you know, and someone who's standing to the side and looking at it really carefully can see the trick, and they're not fooled by the trick. You know, they see that the show is just a show. But also when we're writing, we're a magician too, and we're trying to get people to see and feel certain things, and there is something involved in that has to do with knowing how to do that, you know. And it's of interest to know some of that stuff, I think. Okay, thanks. The conversation part was great. Thanks. Yeah.
And I would be remiss, I did this quickly when I was introducing it, but I didn't actually get to express gratitude. This talk and Kate's visit is brought in part by the work of many others, and funding from all 5 colleges, from here at Smith College, from the Buddhist Studies concentration, the English department, the Poetry Center, the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life, and then all the other colleges as well, Mount Holyoke, Hampshire, Amherst, UMass, and also the 5 College Collective, and Jay Garfield and all these other folks. So a lot of folks and their finances have come together to make this happen. So I'm very thankful for them and very thankful for you, Kate. So thanks so much.
Thanks, yeah. And the plumber who eventually came and everything. Thanks.